The telegram sat on the desk for 3 full minutes before anyone picked it up. Franklin Delano Roosevelt looked at it from his wheelchair, reading glasses perched on his nose, a half-burned cigarette resting in the ashtray beside him. His military aide, a young colonel named Harrison, stood by the door, quiet and composed, waiting to be told what to do. Outside the Oval Office windows, Washington was caught in one of those heavy August afternoons where the heat made everything slower and stickier. Roosevelt himself was neither slow nor foggy. His mind was moving quickly. It was August 14th, 1943, and the war that had consumed the world for 4 years had pulled America in nearly 2 years ago. In that time, Roosevelt had come to understand what total war actually demanded. The factory targets, the casualty figures, the grinding logistics behind every battlefield success. He had absorbed the math of modern warfare down to its most unglamorous details. But the numbers in this telegram made no sense. "Colonel Harrison," Roosevelt said at last, in the calm, polished voice millions of Americans knew from his radio addresses, "are these figures confirmed?" "Yes, sir. Checked 3 times through our military office in Ottawa and verified by our intelligence people. The numbers are correct." Roosevelt picked up the telegram and read it again. Canada, a country of 11.5 million people, was now producing more military vehicles than Italy. They were building more ships than Japan had constructed in the past year. They were manufacturing more aircraft than the entire Axis had produced in the previous 6 months. They had mobilized more than 1 million men and women for military service. They were shipping food to Britain in quantities that far exceeded what their population should have been able to generate. They had extended billions of dollars in loans to the Allied war effort, and they showed no signs of slowing down. "How is this possible?" Roosevelt said quietly, mostly to himself. "The math doesn't work. They shouldn't be able to sustain this." Harrison cleared his throat. "Sir, if I may, I think that's precisely why it matters. By conventional economic analysis, Canada should have reached peak production months ago. They should be running short of workers. Their resources should be stretched to the breaking point. Instead, they're accelerating." Roosevelt wheeled himself closer to the window and looked out at Eleanor's rose garden. He thought about his own country, enormous, powerful, 135 million people. America was the arsenal of democracy, and the world knew it. But Canada was doing something that barely seemed credible. A country their size was performing so far beyond expectations that the normal rules of scale and proportion had stopped applying. He had met the Canadian Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King on several occasions, a strange, careful, small man, perpetually anxious about his political standing, deeply preoccupied with spiritualism and seances, not the kind of leader you would expect to drive a nation into a war effort of this magnitude. And yet somehow, through King, or perhaps despite him, Canada had transformed itself into a remarkably efficient war machine. "Get me our own production reports from the War Department," Roosevelt said. "I want side-by-side comparisons, output per capita, resource utilization, pace of industrial conversion, everything." "Yes, sir. Anything specific to focus on?" Roosevelt turned his chair to face Harrison directly. "I want to know whether we're performing as well as they are, accounting for size. And if we aren't, I want to know exactly why not." The reports arrived 2 days later, compiled by analysts who had worked through the night. Roosevelt read them in his study with Harry Hopkins sitting across from him, his closest advisor, thin and worn down by illness, but as sharp and loyal as ever. "It's remarkable," Hopkins said, turning through the pages. "Every metric puts Canada ahead of where they should be. They've converted 92% of their automotive industry to military production." 92? Franklin, we've managed 73, and we have 10 times their population. Roosevelt lit another cigarette. His doctors had suggested he cut back. There were larger concerns at the moment. "Look at the shipbuilding numbers," Roosevelt said, pressing a finger to one of the pages. "They're completing corvettes and cargo vessels faster than we're building Liberty ships, and our program is supposed to be the fastest in history." "The Canadian yards are running triple shifts," Hopkins explained. "They've brought women into the workforce at scale, trained them in weeks to perform work that used to require years of apprenticeship. They've simplified their designs, standardized components, and applied assembly line principles to ship construction in a way that mirrors automobile manufacturing. We're doing the same, yes, but they're doing it more efficiently relative to their size." Roosevelt smoked in silence for a moment. He reminded himself that this was not a competition. Canada was an ally, a neighbor, a friend. Their success was the Allied cause's success. But something about the numbers was unsettling in a way he couldn't quite set aside. They suggested a level of national commitment that even America, for all its patriotic fervor, had not quite matched. "What's driving this?" he asked. "What makes a nation of 11 million people perform like this?" Hopkins considered the question carefully. "I think it's several things working together. First, they're genuinely afraid. Britain is their emotional and cultural motherland. If Britain falls, they understand they'll be isolated in North America with us. And while we're allies now, they remember we weren't always." Hopkins paused with a slight smile. "They remember 1812. Roosevelt allowed himself a small smile at that. The War of 1812, when America had attempted to invade Canada and failed rather badly, not a chapter American history books dwelled on. Second, Hopkins continued, they have no real option. They're a small country that chose to fight a global war. They can't afford to do it halfway. If they're going to commit, the commitment has to be total. Otherwise, they might as well not have bothered. And third, he paused, I think they're proving something to us, to Britain, to themselves. They're not a colonial backwater. They're a nation that belongs at the table with the great powers. Every ship they build, every aircraft they deliver, every soldier they train is a statement of that. Roosevelt nodded slowly. That made sense. Canada had earned its independence gradually, without the dramatic rupture that had forged American identity. They had fought in the First World War and bled terribly for it, but even that had not quite established them as a fully independent nation in the world's eyes. This war was their opportunity to prove themselves, and they were seizing it with everything they had. I want to visit their facilities, Roosevelt said suddenly. The factories, the training bases, the shipyards. I want to see this firsthand. Hopkins raised an eyebrow. That would be a significant diplomatic gesture. It would be read as a public acknowledgement of their contribution. Good. They've earned the acknowledgement. Set it up. The visit was arranged for late September. Roosevelt traveled by train to Montreal, where Prime Minister King and a Canadian delegation met him on the platform. Press coverage was extensive. photographers recording every moment of the American president's arrival on Canadian soil. King was nervous, as he almost always was around Roosevelt. The Canadian Prime Minister felt perpetually overshadowed by his American counterpart, and with good reason. Roosevelt had presence, charisma, that quality that made people lean forward when he spoke. King was shrewd and competent, but he had never inspired anyone in his life. Still, King had prepared carefully. The tour he had arranged would demonstrate Canadian achievements without appearing to boast. That delicate balance was entirely typical of his approach to everything. The first stop was a factory in Montreal that had been producing railway cars before the war and was now manufacturing Valentine tanks, a British design that Canadian factories had adopted and improved upon. Roosevelt's wheelchair was brought onto the factory floor, and he watched as workers assembled vehicles with practiced efficiency. A young woman, she could not have been more than 20, was welding armor plates onto a tank hull. She wore thick gloves and a protective mask, and her movements were confident and precise. When the tour group approached, she finished her weld, shut off her torch, and lifted her mask. "Mr. President," she said, and Roosevelt could hear the effort she was making to sound professional over her nervousness. "What's your name?" he asked. "Marie Fontaine, sir. I'm from Quebec City. How long have you been doing this work, Marie?" 6 months, sir. I was working in a dress shop before. They recruited me, trained me for 3 weeks, and I've been welding tanks ever since." Roosevelt studied the weld she had just completed. He didn't know much about welding, but he could see it was clean and even. "Do you like the work?" Marie considered the question. "It's hard, sir. Hot in summer, cold in winter, and the hours are long. But yes, I like it. I'm good at it, and it matters. Every tank I help build is one more piece of armor between my brother and a German bullet." "Your brother's in the service?" "Yes, sir. Infantry. He's in Italy right now. Then we'll make sure he has all the tanks he needs." "Thank you for your service, Marie." They moved on through the factory. More workers, welders, assemblers, inspectors, men and women working side by side. The factory manager reported their production statistics. 12 tanks per day, every day, 7 days a week, for the past 18 months, with no indication of slowing. "What's your turnover rate?" Hopkins asked. "About 4% annually, sir. Very low for wartime industry." "Why is that?" The manager shrugged. "Pride, mostly. People know they're good at what they do. They know it matters. We pay fair wages, provide good conditions, treat people with respect. Turns out that's worth more than a few extra cents an hour." From Montreal, they traveled to Halifax, where the shipyards dominated the harbor. Here, Roosevelt saw the corvettes that Canada was building in remarkable numbers, small warships designed for convoy escort duty, unglamorous but absolutely essential to keeping the Atlantic supply lines open. A grizzled shipyard supervisor named Mackenzie walked Roosevelt along the dock, pointing out vessels at various stages of completion. "We can build one of these in 4 months now," Mackenzie said with evident satisfaction. "When we started, it took us 9. We learned, got better, figured out what worked and what didn't." "How many are you building simultaneously?" "Right now, 16. We have capacity for 20, but we're holding some slips in reserve for repairs and refits." Roosevelt did the arithmetic quickly. If they could complete a corvette in 4 months with 16 under construction simultaneously, they were finishing 4 per month. 48 per year from this single yard. And there were other yards across Canada doing the same. Mr. Mackenzie, how do you maintain quality control at this pace? How do you ensure these ships are genuinely seaworthy and combat-ready? Mackenzie smiled, showing teeth stained by tobacco. That's the question, isn't it? The answer is we test everything. Every weld gets inspected. Every system gets checked. We do sea trials on every vessel before we hand it over to the Navy. We're building fast, but we're not cutting corners. A ship that sinks because of poor construction is worse than no ship at all. They toured one of the nearly completed corvettes. Roosevelt's wheelchair could not navigate the narrow companionways, so his Secret Service detail carried him aboard, something he hated and accepted as a necessity. The vessel was cramped and functional, designed entirely for purpose rather than comfort, but everything was solidly built and professionally installed. The officer who would take command of the vessel was there, a young lieutenant commander named Peterson. He showed Roosevelt the bridge, the engine room, the crew quarters. "She's not pretty," Peterson said, "but she'll do the job. These corvettes roll badly in heavy seas, but they can take punishment and keep going." "Have you commanded one before?" "Yes, sir. My last ship was sunk by a U-boat 6 months ago. Took a torpedo amidships. We lost 18 men, but the rest of us made it to lifeboats and were picked up 12 hours later." "I'm sorry for your losses," Roosevelt said quietly. "Thank you, sir. But that's exactly why I'm eager to take this one out. Every U-boat we sink means fewer convoys attacked, fewer ships lost, fewer men drowned. It's personal now." From Halifax, they flew to Toronto, where Roosevelt visited an aircraft factory that had grown from a small operation producing training planes into a massive facility, turning out Lancaster bombers under license from Britain. The factory floor seemed to stretch endlessly. Bomber fuselages lined up in long rows like enormous insects waiting to receive their wings. The factory director was a woman, Margaret Henderson, which surprised Roosevelt, though he kept it from showing. She was in her 50s, gray-haired and formidable, carrying herself with the bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime declining to accept limits. "Before the war, I managed a textile factory," Henderson explained as she led Roosevelt through the facility, made uniforms for the railways. "When the war started, the government asked if I could convert to military production. I said yes. They shut down my textile operation and gave me this facility to run. That's quite a transition." Roosevelt observed, "Yes and no. Manufacturing is manufacturing. You have inputs, processes, outputs. You have workers who need training and supervision. You have quality standards to maintain. The specific product changes, but the fundamental work of management doesn't." They paused beside a nearly completed bomber. Technicians were threading electrical systems through the fuselage with careful precision. "How many are you producing?" Roosevelt asked. "We're averaging 6 per week. Our target is 8, and we'll reach it by the end of the year." 6 per week was over 300 annually. Roosevelt knew the Lancaster was among the finest heavy bombers in the war, capable of carrying enormous payloads deep into Germany. 300 Lancasters represented a serious striking force. Where do they go once they're complete? Most go to RCAF squadrons overseas, Henderson said. Some go to the RAF under transfer arrangements. A few remain here for training. Roosevelt watched the workers for a while. At least half were women, most of them in their 20s and 30s. working with the same focused efficiency he had seen at the tank factory, the same unmistakable sense of purpose. "Mrs. Henderson," Roosevelt said, "may I ask you something directly?" "Of course, Mr. President. How long can this pace be sustained? Your country has been mobilized for 4 years. You're running multiple shifts, working your population at full capacity. At some point, doesn't something have to give?" Henderson smiled slightly. "You're asking whether we're going to burn out, whether we'll hit a wall where we simply can't continue. Essentially, yes." She took her time with the answer. "I won't deceive you, Mr. President. It's hard. People are tired. 4 years of rationing, long hours, families separated. The strain is real. But I think you're asking the wrong question. What should I be asking? You should be asking what we're fighting for, whether the cause is worth the cost. And for most Canadians, the answer is yes. Overwhelmingly, yes. We know what fascism means. We've heard the accounts from Europe. We understand what happens if Hitler wins. So we keep working. We keep building, not because it's easy, but because the alternative is something we refuse to accept." Roosevelt nodded slowly. "How long could you maintain this production level if you had to?" Henderson didn't hesitate. "As long as it takes, Mr. President. We'll build planes until there are no more targets to bomb, or until we run out of materials, whichever comes first. And frankly, I believe we'll outlast them." That evening, Roosevelt dined with Prime Minister King and several Canadian cabinet ministers at the official residence in Ottawa. The conversation was polished and diplomatic, filled with the appropriate language about Allied cooperation and shared sacrifice. But after dinner, when the other guests had gone and only King, Roosevelt, and Hopkins remained, the tone shifted. They sat in King's study, Roosevelt in his wheelchair with a brandy, King in an armchair looking characteristically tense, Hopkins on the sofa taking notes. "William," Roosevelt said, using King's first name as a gesture of informality, "I need to understand something. The production numbers I'm seeing from Canada are extraordinary. They suggest a level of mobilization that should be unsustainable. But everywhere I've been today, I've seen no signs of collapse or even serious strain. Your workers seem determined. Your factories are efficient. Your quality holds. How are you doing this?" King shifted slightly. He had never been comfortable being put on the spot, even by a friend. "It's not any single thing, Franklin," he said. "It's many factors working together. We have a population genuinely committed to the cause. We have abundant natural resources. We built solid industrial capacity before the war. We have good working relations with the unions, which has saved us from most of the strikes and disruptions that plague other countries. But other countries have those things too," Roosevelt pressed. "Britain has all of that, and they're running on fumes. The Soviets have unlimited manpower and resources, and their production is still chaotic. What's actually different about Canada?" King was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think it's because we have something to prove, explain. We're not a great power, Franklin. We're not Britain or America or Russia. We're a middle power, a secondary player in global affairs. Everyone knows it, including us. But in this war, we've had the chance to demonstrate that we matter, that we can contribute meaningfully to victory, that we're not simply Britain's loyal dominion or America's northern neighbor, but a nation in our own right, with capabilities that demand respect." King leaned forward, more animated than Roosevelt had seen him in all their years of acquaintance. "Every tank we build, Every ship we launch, every aircraft we send overseas is a statement about Canadian identity. It says we belong at the table with the great powers. It says we're not spectators in this conflict. We're participants shaping its outcome. That's worth something, Franklin. That's worth the sacrifice and the exhaustion and the strain. Roosevelt studied King's face. The usually cautious prime minister had set his wariness aside, and what was visible underneath was something genuine. "And you believe this can be sustained?" Roosevelt asked. "I believe it must be sustained, because if we falter, if we fail to maintain our contribution, we lose the moral authority we've earned. We get relegated back to secondary status, and all this sacrifice means nothing beyond the military contribution itself. We will have fought our hardest war and still ended up invisible." Hopkins spoke up from the sofa. "Prime Minister, what happens after the war, when this industrial capacity is no longer needed for military production?" King smiled thinly. "That, Mr. Hopkins, is the question that keeps me awake at night. We'll have 1,000,000 men and women to demobilize, factories to convert back to peacetime production, debts to repay, and an economy to restructure. It will be difficult. But that's a problem for tomorrow. Today, we win the war." The following morning, Roosevelt departed Ottawa for Washington. As his train rolled south through the countryside, he sat in his private car with Hopkins, reviewing notes and working through what he had seen. "They can fight forever," Roosevelt said suddenly. Hopkins looked up. "Not literally forever, of course, but longer than Hitler can. Longer than the Axis can sustain their war machine. The Canadians have found a way to mobilize their entire society without breaking it, a system that's efficient, sustainable, and actually builds momentum over time rather than depleting itself." Hopkins nodded. "The question is whether we can do the same, whether we can learn from what they've done. We're already doing it, Harry. We're the arsenal of democracy. Our absolute production dwarfs Canada's, but not in relative terms, not per capita. They're outperforming us by that measure, Franklin, which means either they're doing something we're not, or we're leaving capacity on the table." Roosevelt knew Hopkins was right. America was powerful, but it was not fully mobilized, not the way Canada was. Luxury goods were still being produced. Workers remained in non-essential industries. Significant wealth was being held rather than redirected toward the war effort. "The American people won't accept total mobilization," Roosevelt said. "They'll support the war effort. They'll buy bonds. They'll send their sons to fight. But they won't accept the comprehensive rationing and industrial conversion Canada has implemented. We're too large, too diverse, too individualistic." "Maybe," Hopkins said, "or maybe we just haven't made the argument properly. Maybe we haven't explained clearly enough why total mobilization is necessary." Roosevelt thought about Marie Fontaine welding tanks in Montreal, about Margaret Henderson running her bomber factory, about the workers in Halifax completing corvettes in 4 months instead of 9. All of them operating at maximum effort, all of them understanding precisely why it mattered. "We need to do better," he said quietly. "We need to learn from what the Canadians are doing and adapt it to our own situation. Not copy them exactly, but take the principles and apply them to our context." He spent the rest of the journey drafting notes for a speech he would give to Congress, a speech about production targets and industrial mobilization, a speech shaped by what he had seen in Canada, though he would not say so explicitly. Americans needed to believe they were leading, not following, even when they were learning from someone else. The months that followed brought American war production to levels that had not seemed achievable a year earlier. New factories were built. Existing facilities were expanded. More women entered the industrial workforce. Rationing tightened. The entire economy was directed toward a single objective. Whether the acceleration was directly caused by Roosevelt's Canadian visit or would have happened regardless is impossible to say with certainty. The trend had been building throughout 1943, but the trip seemed to crystallize something in Roosevelt's thinking, to make viscerally real what the production reports had been suggesting in the abstract, that there was more America could and should be doing. In early 1944, Roosevelt requested another statistical comparison of American and Canadian war output. The new figures showed the gap had narrowed. American per capita production had increased significantly, though Canada still held a slight edge in certain categories. "We're improving," Roosevelt told Hopkins when he reviewed the data. "The Canadians are still improving too," Hopkins pointed out. "They're not standing still." "I know. But that's good. It means we're all pushing each other." Competition among allies can be healthy if it's properly directed. By mid-1944, Allied war production had reached levels the Axis simply could not match. American factories were pouring out aircraft, ships, and vehicles in staggering quantities. British factories had recovered from the Blitz and were producing steadily. Soviet factories relocated beyond the Urals were grinding out tanks and artillery, and Canadian factories, those efficient, relentless operations that had so struck Roosevelt, continued their output without interruption. The invasion of Normandy in June 1944 was made possible by this collective production achievement. The thousands of landing craft, the aircraft, the vehicles that made D-Day work, all of them came from Allied factories that had learned to operate at peak efficiency. Canadian forces stormed Juno Beach on June 6th, supported by equipment built in Montreal and Halifax and Toronto by workers like Marie Fontaine, managed by people like Margaret Henderson. The tanks worked, the ships worked, the aircraft worked, the system Canada had built delivered exactly what was needed, when it was needed, where it was needed. Roosevelt tracked the Normandy invasion reports from the White House, following the progress of Allied forces across the beaches and into France. He thought about his visit to Canada, about the factories and the shipyards and the workers who had made it all possible. He thought about what King had said, about fighting to prove something, about national identity being forged in the heat of an existential struggle. Canada was establishing itself in this war as a nation that genuinely mattered on the world stage. When the peace was negotiated and the post-war order took shape, Canada would have earned a seat at the table. In October 1944, Roosevelt was elected to an unprecedented fourth term. The election was closer than his previous victories. The American people were weary of war, hungry for peace, but they still trusted him to see it through. After the election, he received a congratulatory telegram from King, formal and diplomatic, as King's communications always were. But there was a postscript, handwritten, clearly added after the official draft was complete. "Franklin, thank you for understanding what we are trying to achieve. Thank you for seeing Canada as a partner, not simply as a subordinate. It matters more than you know. William." Roosevelt smiled when he read it. He dictated a response, through his secretary, William. Canada has proven itself beyond any reasonable doubt. You have built a war machine of remarkable efficiency, and it has shown no signs of breaking down. When historians write about this war, they will marvel at what your nation accomplished. I am honored to call you ally and friend. Franklin. The winter of 1944 to 1945 was the last winter of the war in Europe. The Allies were advancing on every front. The Soviet Red Army was pushing toward Berlin from the east. British, American, and Canadian forces were crossing the Rhine. The end was visible at last. Canadian production did not slow. If anything, it intensified, building for the final offensive, for the push into Germany itself, for whatever would be needed afterward. The factories ran their triple shifts. The shipyards launched their corvettes. The aircraft plants assembled their bombers. The system King and his people had built kept turning. Roosevelt's health was failing, though few beyond his immediate circle understood how serious it had become. The years of strain, leading the nation through the Depression, then through the worst war in human history, combined with the cigarettes and the relentless pressure and the physical toll of his illness, were all catching up with him at once. His doctors were deeply concerned. Roosevelt himself seemed barely to notice. He had work left to finish. In February 1945, he traveled to Yalta to meet with Churchill and Stalin. The conference would shape the post-war world, dividing Germany into zones of occupation, establishing the framework for the United Nations, determining the boundaries of a new international order. During a private dinner with Churchill, the British Prime Minister turned to the subject of Canada. "They've been extraordinary, Franklin," Churchill said, his voice carrying its familiar resonance. "Simply extraordinary. I genuinely don't know what we would have done without them. The ships they've built kept our Atlantic convoys running. The food they've sent fed our civilian population through years when we couldn't feed ourselves. The men they've trained and deployed have fought with distinction in every theater of this war. They proved they could fight forever," Roosevelt said, repeating the phrase he had first used with Hopkins almost 2 years before. They found a way to mobilize completely without breaking themselves. Indeed, and they'll emerge from this war stronger than they entered it, in terms of international standing at the very least. They've earned a place among the nations that matter. Roosevelt nodded, though he felt a wave of exhaustion move through him. The Yalta Conference was drawing on the last reserves of whatever energy he had left. "Winston," he said quietly, "we need to make certain the post-war order includes Canada properly. Not as a British dominion or an American satellite, as an independent nation with its own voice and its own standing." Churchill studied Roosevelt's face with something close to alarm. The American president looked terrible, gray-faced, drawn, worn down in ways that went beyond ordinary fatigue. "Of course, Franklin," I couldn't agree more. "Canada has earned that respect." Roosevelt returned to Washington after Yalta, exhausted beyond what words could adequately describe. He went to his retreat at Warm Springs, Georgia, seeking rest. On April 12, 1945, he complained of a sudden headache, lost consciousness, and died of a cerebral hemorrhage. The news reached Ottawa within hours. King was devastated. He had known Roosevelt for years, had worked with him closely throughout the war, and had come to genuinely respect and admire the man despite their profound differences in temperament and style. King ordered flags lowered to half-mast across Canada, issued a public statement praising Roosevelt's leadership and vision, and then, in the privacy of his diary late that night, wrote something that no official statement could contain. Franklin understood what we were trying to accomplish. He saw Canada not as a minor player or a colonial appendage, but as a nation making its own contribution to victory. He respected our sacrifices and acknowledged our achievements. We have lost a friend. The war in Europe ended less than a month later. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The fighting in the Pacific continued until August, when the atomic bombs and Soviet entry into the Pacific War finally forced Japan to capitulate. Canadian production began winding down in the summer of 1945. Factories started converting back to peacetime goods. Shipyards stopped laying corvettes and began considering what merchant vessels the post-war trade routes would require. Aircraft plants started thinking about civilian aviation. The demobilization was massive and complicated, exactly as King had predicted in Roosevelt's study in Ottawa. Over 1 million Canadians in uniform needed to return to civilian life. Factories needed to retool. The economy needed to shift from total war to sustainable peace. It would take years, but Canada had proven what it set out to prove. Marie Fontaine returned to the garment industry after the war, but she carried with her the skills and the self-assurance she had built on a factory floor in wartime Montreal. She eventually opened her own small manufacturing business, applying the lessons of wartime production, efficiency, quality control, the value of treating workers with respect, to peacetime enterprise. Margaret Henderson continued managing factories after the war, becoming one of the first women executives in Canadian industry. She never lost the sense of purpose she had carried through the war years, the knowledge that her work had directly contributed to something that mattered profoundly. Peterson, who had lost his first Corvette to a U-boat and sworn to make the enemy pay for it, survived the war and remained in the Navy. He eventually reached flag rank, applying the hard-learned lessons of convoy protection to post-war naval strategy. In Washington, President Harry Truman, who had inherited Roosevelt's office and his responsibilities, ordered a comprehensive study of Allied war production. The report, completed in late 1945, confirmed what Roosevelt had observed during his Canadian visit. Canada, with barely 1/12 of America's population, had produced war material at rates that were proportionally higher in several key categories. They had sustained this output for 6 years without major disruption or significant quality failure. They had demonstrated that a well-organized middle power could make contributions that rivaled those of nations many times their size. The report concluded with a section on lessons learned, recommending that American industrial planning adopt specific techniques that had made Canadian production so efficient: simplified designs, standardized components, better labor relations, more comprehensive training programs, rigorous quality control even at high production speeds. Many of these recommendations were implemented in American industry in the post-war years. The acknowledgement was quiet, but genuine. Canada had done something worth learning from. Years later, historians studying Canada's war production would find themselves struggling to fully absorb the numbers. A nation of 11.5 million people had produced more than 800,000 military vehicles of various types, built over 400 warships ranging from corvettes to destroyers to merchant vessels, manufactured more than 16,000 aircraft, trained more than 1 million men and women for military service, provided billions of dollars in aid and loans to Britain and other allies, and shipped food to British civilians in quantities that had prevented what might otherwise have become a famine. Done all of this while maintaining quality standards, avoiding major labor disruptions, and sustaining the effort for 6 full years. The mathematics were extraordinary. The achievement was undeniable. Canada had proven it could fight as long as necessary. They had outlasted the enemy's will and capacity to resist. Roosevelt had seen it coming in August 1943, when he had first read that telegram and could not make the numbers make sense. He had visited the facilities, spoken with the workers and managers, and understood what was actually driving the performance. He had recognized that Canada represented something important, proof that democracy could mobilize effectively, that free societies could match totalitarian states in industrial output, that you did not need a police state or coerced labor to build a formidable war machine. You needed people who believed in the cause and were willing to work for it. Roosevelt never got to see the final victory. He died a month before Germany surrendered and 4 months before Japan capitulated. But he had seen enough to understand how it would end. He had seen the production numbers. He had watched the factories and shipyards operate. He had talked to the workers. He had understood that Canada could fight forever. And in understanding that, he had understood that the Allies would win.